First of all, I want to thank Steve and Trevor for taking the time to not only prepare some material, but also coming down here and taking the time to lead this session. Look, we are not going to solve the world's problems right here in this hour, but and I do want to make it, unless there's a bunch of questions at the end, let's make a point of having this thing done by noon. And this is the first of several financial trainings that we're going to do. And today, and we recognize everyone's at different levels, so what we thought would be the best approach would be to really start from the beginning. As you've heard me say before, a lot of it's just terminology and getting familiar with terminology. And then I think Steve and Trevor are going to dig into really what are the key aspects of the inputs that we should be looking at. And I believe we're going to go into a model there. But know that this is just step one to probably at least one and maybe two more sessions that we'll have that will get a little bit deeper into actual project underwriting. So with that said, I'll turn the mic over to Steve and Trevor.
Yeah, and appreciate everybody's time. You know, certainly as we go through all this, feel free to interrupt with any questions. Certainly want this to be interactive, but I think the one thing I wanted to say before we dove into it is to follow up on what Dave said. And the real goal here was to break this down into a couple of pieces. And first and foremost today, to just talk about what are the key terms that are used in the finance side of the business, along with the key metrics that revolve around a lot of those terms, that we can help you guys to better understand, because the end goal here is, I think, by understanding what are really some relatively simple things, as you increase your knowledge of those terms and those items, those are things that you can start asking your clients and getting information from your clients that you can then turn around through a lot of these different tools and do a better job of understanding what properties are worth or how a deal can be structured. And quite frankly, you know, the goal here is to help everybody close more deals and make more money. And by having this information, certainly think that it's a big step in the direction of being able to do that more efficiently in all the stuff that you see come across your desk. So with that being said, let's kind of dive in here, I think, first and foremost with what Trevor and I wanted to talk about, and that is, you know, let's talk about when a investor looks at a deal, and especially a home building or a land development deal, what are as we broke it down, there are 4 different items that they will focus on in judging the returns of a deal and ultimately arriving at a value. And as we look at this, you know, the way I think of it is you use all these different pieces to ultimately triangulate a value for something, right? There's not one that's necessarily more valuable than another, but in different deals and at different times, some of these different metrics become more valuable. Okay, and so let's hit what those 4 are. The first one is internal rate of return, or IRR, which very simply put in finance terms is the discount rate at which the net present value of all your future cash flows is equal to 0. That probably is about the least exciting sentence you'll hear me say all day. But the real key thing to understand about internal rate of return is what the second line there is. It's a time-sensitive metric that helps to measure the return that you're getting out of a project on a discounted cash flow basis. And it's a very good comparative metric, right? So internal rate of return is really telling you, over the lifespan of a project, what's the annualized return that an investor is making on their money. And when discounted cash flow analysis is performed well, it gives you a very good tool of saying, you know, project A returns a 25% IRR, project B returns a 15%. If the risk profile of the 2 projects is relatively similar, it's better to make a 25%. Okay. The second item that we have up here is equity multiple. And simply put, that's really a measure of profit. And it's telling an investor, and you guys probably hear this quite a bit, because especially on land development and land entitlement deals, equity multiple is often the key metric that they're using, right? Because if we back up, you look at IRR, that tends to be looked at a little bit more heavily, for instance, on home building deals. And it's very sensitive to timing. Equity multiple has no sensitivity to timing whatsoever, which is one of the reasons why it's good with things like entitlement deals, where the cities don't seem to have a lot of sensitivity to timing either. And what it says is, for every dollar that is invested in a project, how much do I receive back when that project's all said and done? Right? And the example I used up here was, if somebody invests $100,000 and the deal closes out, they receive $150,000 back. You've made a 1.5x on your money. Like I say, equity multiple, it's a very good measure of looking at how much you're getting in return for the risk you're taking, which is why it's so commonly used for entitlement deals and the land development side of things, and still, is used very much so on the vertical side, but I'd say it's perhaps not quite as important. The third item we have up there is net margin, which I know is one that everybody here is very familiar with. But simply put, it's just the profit expressed as a percentage of the gross sales revenue, and is a metric that, while the most common on the vertical side of the business, we are seeing become quite a bit more common for straight up land development plays as well. Last item, net profit. I hope I don't have to explain that one. That one's pretty straightforward. Revenues minus expenses. But once again, now the importance of it, though, as simple as that is you could look at a deal and say all the other three metrics check out, but the net profit in the deal, say it's a home building deal, is $750,000. What you'll hear people say is, there's just not enough profit in a deal to make it worth my time, right? It doesn't matter if the IRR looks great, the margins are fantastic. To a certain extent, and especially when you're dealing with clients who are buying their deals in joint ventures with third-party equity providers, at the end of the day, if they're splitting up a very small number between them, it can be very hard to justify the amount that's spent on lawyers to get everything documented, all the due diligence. You name it. Those costs start to add up, and at the end of the day, the idea is you've got to have enough to go around. And so I think that's a good example of what you see with a lot of these deals is when we see something, it'll come in front of us. And say, for instance, using internal rate of return as an example, because what we want to do here is now start to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each of these different metrics, right? IRR, for instance, is time sensitive. And in very simple terms, let's say that somebody invests $1 today, and in a year they get back $1.25. The internal rate of return on that investment is 25%, which would check the box for most investors in terms of what the return needs to be. But their equity multiple is only 1.25. And their net profit is, in that example, 25 cents. That's when you start to look at some of these different things and you realize, well, while the IRR can look good, it's deceiving, right? The money hasn't been out long enough. Because, for instance, if you were to get a 25% IRR on that same deal over a 3-year period, instead of putting $1 out, you're getting about $1.80 back, right? So you would have gone from a 1.25 equity multiple to a 1.8. All of a sudden, you've got enough money left to spread around amongst the partners to justify the time that goes into one of these deals. And that's where, I think, especially if you're sitting in the shoes that you guys are and you're dealing with with the builders in particular every day, you look at a deal and it may be real easy to look at it and think, well, what we're hearing guys say are traditionally, 10% net margin, a deal is going to work. When you use some of these other metrics, it can make you realize it doesn't always shake out like that. Right, and all these different pieces are basically a way of balancing the total profit somebody's making with the amount of time that it takes to do something, and trying to account for the risk at the same time, if that makes sense to everyone.
And just to add to that, I think we hear all the time, and Steve has touched on it with the triangulating all these different points, is that we hear all the time, I'm sure you guys hear all the time, it's a 40 IRR, or some ridiculous IRR, which everyone thinks what a great deal they have. But to Steve's point, if that deal is a one-year deal, then your multiple isn't going to be high enough to get where you need to be from an investor standpoint. And vice versa. Right? I mean, well, I don't think we get into that now, but if it goes too long and your IRR drops, but sorry.
Yeah. No, but I think Dave's making a very important point there, which is, all these different metrics can look good at varying points, but it's the process of understanding what they are and then being able to quickly look at those as you look through, performers you put together or produced for you. And if you understand what your clients are looking for on these fronts, at the end of the day, it allows you the opportunity to really back into understanding how you can make that deal work, right? Or for instance, or even, another way of putting it is, who's the right client to get it in front of based upon what I see? So anybody have any questions about, these 4 different metrics, the pros and cons of them? Reimers.
It might be on your other key financial terms there near the bottom, but one of the things that I've noticed in the last year or so is that public builders are much more focused on gross margin than they are net margin, at least in their underwriting. And everybody defines it a little bit differently, and I think maybe, look, you guys focus primarily on deals that are being underwritten by private builders and institutional or quasi-institutional equity, and that requires a certain, view of the world. One of the things that's been, I would say, frustrating to a degree, but also it's just we don't quite have the tools that make it doable right now, is a lot of times we're evaluating deals based on, is it a public builder, is it a private builder? The public builders are underwriting it completely differently than the private guys. They've got their own internal cost of funds. Question is, some guys will apply that cost of funds day one when that deal's booked, regardless of peak outstanding capital. It just starts clicking because they push the money off the mother balance sheet, or allocate it anyway. So, there are those elements too where some of these other things that didn't used to be as big a deal now are, it's kind of like the underwriting universe is shifting a bit, particularly for the publics and how they look at this stuff. And so you wind up basically running 2 different cash flows to some degree, as I've talked with you guys and worked with Trevor on. To try and figure out, all right, does this make more sense as a public builder or as a private builder? So it's more a comment, I guess, than anything. And the trick with gross margin is it's defined differently. So it's really just like, what is SG&A, and then the rest of it is, goes into your gross margin. But I was wondering if you guys see a lot of variability or if it's a pretty tight view of the world on the underwriting from the private side. In other words, do different equity partners look at it more like a public, or does the private equity world pretty much see everything the same way?
They see pretty much everything the same way. There's in terms of how they arrive at their bottom line numbers, they're all going to do that in a very similar fashion, and that's going to be on a net basis because it's incorporating the actual cost of the debt into it, and they are looking at things, and we could actually have a nice long conversation all afternoon about whether looking at it leveraged or unleveraged is the right way to do it.
Right.
But the shortcut answer to that is they all look at it leveraged because that's also the way that they are compensated themselves at the end of the day. So everything's going to come down to a net basis.
Okay.
Right,
So-
because, in particular, because especially in today's world, it is vital for any private builder who's looking to go vertical to have a bank construction loan to make the deal pencil. To say that it's difficult to get a private deal financed if you can't sign on the bottom line with a bank is an understatement.
So when you talk about IRR in this presentation, are you talking about unleveraged or leveraged, or are you going to make the distinction between the two?
We're going to make a little bit of a distinction here as we move on, although at the end of the day, when we talk about IRR, it's going to be leveraged. Right, at least on a home building deal. Could be a little bit different on a land development business plan, right? Primarily because there is very little debt available for those deals.
Right. And they're usually done all equity anyway. And then usually don't do deals.
Distribute a printout of that.
Ready to take it back.
Oh, it's taken care of. Yeah, let's scroll down a little bit now. We're going to move on after we go through just a few other terms and have Trevor walk us through a real-time deal that we did that shows some of the impacts of these different changes in terms of looking at things on a discounted cash flow basis versus a static basis. I think even before that, just want to make sure we covered a couple of other big picture terms that I'm sure you guys hear quite a bit of the time, but I think they're important to walk through quickly. The first one being capital stack. Is everybody familiar with what that term means? Somebody says it?
Yep.
And in our world, in particular, it's always important to be looking at what the breakdown in that is between the debt and the equity components, right? And if I'm in your shoes, one of the things that I always want to understand is, with that prospective buyer that's in front of me, what are they assuming about the debt? I think in today's world, that is the thing that has the most potential to blow up your escrows from a financing perspective. We see a ton of people that come to us with deals that they have tied up that have debt assumptions that they are not capable of achieving. And we can talk more about that as we move along, but that's an area where you guys want to be really, really careful in scrutinizing what it is they're representing that they're going to do.
That's a really good point. Let me add to that. As we, get more and more comfortable with this terminology, and as you're talking to potential buyers, we really need to dig into what their financing assumptions are. Because Steve's point is right on, and we see it all the time, that they think the deal looks good, but when you dig a couple layers deep and look in the debt assumptions, they're flat out wrong, and not only wrong by a little bit, but often wrong by a lot. And so as you're selecting your right buyer, that could have a big impact on whether they're going to follow through and close or not.
To that end, and this is coming off of a conversation we had with Adam last week regarding, that margin that deal really has to be meeting in order for a private guy to get a deal financed. All that stuff's going to move, some more than others, based on the current market conditions. So what I would find helpful is, a private, if he throws a 12 net margin at you, that deal isn't getting done today.
Correct.
He told us
Probably not.
that'd be a 15% net margin these days. So you guys have that real time.
And we're going to show you why in an example as we move through this.
And you guys have that real time data. So, since you're out in front of us communicating, like, okay, well, LTVs have now changed, or whatever it is, our ability to effectively communicate how that's ebbing and flowing, helpful.
Good mindset.
You guys have the info, we don't.
Well, and I think you can build on that a little bit, but that's certainly an area we've talked about a lot, and we're continually working on addressing and getting a system put in place to.
Yeah, and that's what I was no one really caught my joke there, but that's what Mindset's for, right? Is we get information from the capital markets and we're learning about these things and how things are changing. We need to display that information to you guys so that you're keenly aware of, just as you say, how dynamic the capital markets are.
Right, Trevor, let's just use that as a chance to go to the example that we have here.
That's a young.
We might want to increase the focus on that a little bit.
Zoom in a little more too, Trev, you can.
A little more. Do one more. There you go. Let's go up to the top here.
Do you want to scoot up?
You don't use a mouse.
Scoot one to the right so you don't cut off the thing. We don't want to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so this, I think you guys are all pretty familiar with this. This is a basic static analysis. We took a project that we worked on here in real time, 36-unit deal. So we've got 4 different floor plans. All the inputs. We know what the pricing was. We had all the different expenses and assumptions. We got our sales and closing costs. Trev, let's keep going down a little bit.
Direct.
Builders giving us the directs and the indirects, and we've got everything in here, right? But in a very simple world, if we just looked at this deal and said,
I think if you click
Enable.
thanks, and a 12% margin. If we looked at this deal and said, okay, it's an infill deal, in this case it's FHA compliant, a lot of good things about the deal, checks a lot of boxes, a lot of interest, but let's say we thought that a builder could do it at a 12% margin. That implied that the land value was $1.4 million based upon all the other costs. Okay. In this case, when you did the discounted cash flow analysis, which we'll show you next, the actual purchase price of the land to make the deal work is $900, just over $900. Right? I mean, we're looking at almost a 50% delta between the two. Okay, and if you go in here and we'll undo this, see the actual margin that you had to get to back into the land value that worked was 15.8%. Okay, this is a private builder deal where the builder was able to get a construction loan from a Southern California-based bank at very attractive terms, and they had the balance sheet to sign recourse on that loan.
When you say land value that worked for the seller, then?
For the buyer.
For the buyer.
And the investor.
Right? If we just looked at this real quickly and said, well, I feel like this needs a 12% margin, it would have implied a $1.4 million land value. The actual value that the deal was able to get done at was just over $900,000. Right? And so you look at that and you say, well, why is that the case? So we'll look at the discounted cash flow analysis that was done here. Okay, we can see over here are our various returns. That margin that we just talked about, 15.8, you can see on this front. The thing is, the IRRs on the deal are great. Right? We're at a 45 unlevered, we're at a 60 levered. I mean, that seems fantastic. Oh, but guess what? This project only goes on for
19 months.
19 months. So IRR on a short project, you have to kind of throw it out the window, and that's when we talked earlier about how you triangulate these things. If somebody says, oh, well, a builder needs a 25 IRR to make a deal like this work, in this case, that's BS. IRR is quite frankly something that they'll all look at as the 4th or 5th option. Instead, what they're looking at is they're saying, what's the leveraged equity multiple I can return in a transaction like this? from a capital partner, the kind of group that's going to fund a deal like this, typically what they're going to say is, I've got to have, I mean, what did they want here, Trev? Was it a minimum?
1.5.
A minimum 1.5. And remember, when you start, splitting this up and you have a promote for your builder, that deal level 1.75 means that the person who puts up 90% of the money is getting a lot less.
I think repeat that again. When we talk about a 1.5 to the investor, I know it sounds a lot less than the 1.76 that we're looking at, but maybe just describe one more time the split between sponsor and investor.
Yeah. And, slow me down here or have me repeat any of it if this isn't clear. But in the most straightforward and simplest of terms, what we're looking at here are deal level returns, right? And says just for every nominal dollar that goes into the deal, this is what comes back. However, when you're dealing with private parties, the private builders, or the private land developers, and they're doing these in ventures with somebody else, they're only putting up a fraction of the money, typically 5 or 10% of the total equity that's required. Their partner is going to put up 90% of the money. And in that venture, the sponsor, so the group that's putting up 10%, is going to get a promote if the deal goes according to plan. What I mean by promote is, it means as there's more profit available in the deal, they receive a higher percentage of that profit. So a very simple example would be, let's say they put up 10% of the money, the other group puts up 90%. At a certain return threshold, that'll switch around. Instead of them getting only 10% of the profits, they may start getting 30% of the profits, and the other group gets 70%. Right, and it's sort of their reward for the work that they're doing. And in all cases, when you have clients that are looking at doing ventures, that's the whole reason they're doing them. That they're taking some of that extra risk, that they're doing the legwork every day, is they want that extra piece of upside. Well, how does that all tie back to what we see right here? Because when you get into the promote and you're the JV equity partner providing the larger piece, you start to get a lesser and lesser percentage as the deal gets better, which means if a deal throws off an equity multiple of 1.75 on a typical waterfall, that may only mean that the equity investor is getting a 1.5 or a 1.6 on their money. Your sponsor may be getting a 3x or a 4x. They get that outsized return, but the equity investor is going to look at it and say, wait, I have to hit some kind of a minimum. Okay, and that's what drove a deal like this, is at a 12% margin.
1.54.
Trev, what's
1.54 deal level?
Deal level, if you size it at 12, which you have on
what's
the other model.
You said what were the returns if you?
If you go to this version. And you solve back to your 12 margin. Right down here. 1.54 equity multiple.
Right. And then when you start to split that up, that means that the group that puts up 90% of the money gets a lot less than a 1.54, and we get back to the problem of what's the actual amount of profit that I'm generating at the end of the day. Wow, this is a lot of work to not make the kind of money that I could hopefully make someplace else. Coming?
Yeah, very good.
Yeah. And so in this particular deal, let's actually go back to where we were. Yeah. So in this deal, whereas at a quick cursory glance, we could have said the land was worth 1.4. It actually ends up that it can only be worth $900,000 to get the whole thing to pencil out. And the margin that we had to get to here was more or less a 15, Doug, like we talked about the other day, right? While traditionally it may seem like that is an acceptable private builder margin, with the way things are working today, it can skew a lot of these different metrics. And I think that's where you start to see the value in something like this and being able to understand what the hot buttons are, which are different for every deal and often different on a client-by-client basis. Anybody have any other questions about this particular example?
I have a question on when it gets to the actual waterfall structure and the promoter versus the, real money. Obviously, it's beneficial for us to understand that. Is that something that we should be underwriting? Is that something, or is that, because that's a separate agreement? I mean, that's their...
I think the simple answer is no. I would not worry about that as much on your end.
Yeah.
It's great to be cognizant of it, but what you'll find is if you want to look at the deal level first and foremost, because what happens in that waterfall can be shifted around in so many different ways.
If it starts going around, that's where we
That's
come
like
in
kind of
and
the secret sauce that's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
In terms of really understanding what a piece of property is worth or what the ability of somebody is going to be to transact on it in all likelihood, if you understand it at the deal level, that's where you're going to get the most value out of it.
Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions before we go back, or Kidder, we missed anything here?
No, that's good.
Was there anything written on that go-to-meeting chat board? Okay.
Hey, for you guys out there, I think you figured out the technology here, but if you have questions, apparently you have to write them in, and so we're looking for them, and we'll field your questions as they come.
Want to check back again, just make sure?
Yeah, where is it here?
Chrome icon?
That on the left.
Yeah, that one. Oh. Where's Riley's going?
Isn't the answer different if you can sell to a public?
Yeah, good eye.
And isn't that part of our value add, which is what we said we figure out how to structure the deal so that it is attractive to the public?
Sure, I understand that.
It kind of goes to the
repeat that
comments I was making earlier, that this model where you have to layer in the full capital stack with third-party debt is that's a private builder model as opposed to running a cash flow on public builder assumptions. IRR may be, some of the terms may be the same, but the way they get capitalized, the way the interest gets applied to project cost is different. So I think that's what Steve's trying to say is, it's one thing just to understand the cash flow and how it works. I think the next level is our analysis usually is who's the right client for this, not which is the right private for it, but how can I structure this as a public deal, which is ultimately, I think we all get the pressure from our sellers. Hey, public, I want to structure this deal so a public can do it, because they know public cost of funds are so damn low. What I don't think sellers always understand is how publics apply their cost of funds, how structure doesn't, if you get a seller carry to a public, it doesn't matter to them as much as, deferred, cash payment on a private would juice the IRR and make it more attractive to a private. So I think there are those elements that we kind of struggle with day in and day out as we're shifting back and forth between the public builder realm and the private builder realm.
Yes, well, and look, if there's one thing that would be hugely valuable moving forward in the communications that everybody's having, in particular with the publics, it's asking them good, detailed questions to try and get more insight into how they are handling those items. Because it not only is it different, I think, to answer this question, but it's different from the privates. It's also different between almost every one of the publics to some nature.
Absolutely.
Right? And at least in some of the conversations I've had, I've gotten the sense that even the people that work for the publics don't totally understand that in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Well, and so sometimes you run across a deal where you're hamstrung giving the seller bad news that it's a deal that a public won't take a look at, so you're left dealing with privates. Privates are subject to their capital, and if this, I use Warmington as an example, they've pretty much come out and told me, look, our money is more expensive than everybody else, so we're going to have a tougher time competing with even our other private builder brethren who have different horses in the stable, so to speak, from
Mhm.
a private equity perspective and from a lending relationship perspective. So sometimes we're stuck giving that bad news back to the seller. It's like, oh, you know, the only guys that are really interested right now, your expectations here, they're way the hell down here because on this deal they need a higher equity multiple or their capital partners have a higher IRR threshold. Well, why don't you sell it to a public? Well, it's too few units, it's on septic, it's got this ward or that ward. So, you know, being able to kind of navigate that stuff and at least have the basis upon which to understand this stuff so we can relay it back to the seller, I think is probably job number one, it seems like most days for us now. So I think that's part of what Steve's talking to as well.
Yeah. Well, and Steve, I see your follow-up question, which was, is the only reason the land value is what you said it was because the investor needed to make a 1.5 multiple, whereas with the public, the return hurdles will be gross margin and IRR and maybe gross dollar profit. And I think, in very simple terms, I mean, yes, that is a pretty good summary there. In this case, that the land value and how that deal worked, the primary driving factor in it was the need for the investor to hit a minimum equity multiple. And certainly on deals where we've seen publics involved, and in a case like this, you know, one of the things about this project is you weren't going to find a public going into a deal of this size in this particular location, right? It just, there wasn't enough to this deal to be enticing to them. But if it were, you're absolutely right that they'd be more focused on gross margin, IRR, and to some extent, just the amount of profit dollars that are in a deal.
Did he already own the dirt, or did he have to go back and retrade?
Did not have to retrade the dirt in this case.
Okay.
But a deal like this, you know, just to get it at that price, I think was the result of a significant amount of time invested in negotiating this deal. Okay. He had done a good job of arriving at the right price in the dirt in the example he used. One of the things that we are seeing all too often in other deals that are coming to us from the privates in particular is saying, yeah, I underwrote this deal to a 10% margin. And they haven't done this. So when you go and you try and back into, okay, guys, how are you going to get this financed? The answer is only with a very large retrade. Right. The other thing that is different between the privates and the publics here and the way they're going to look at these deals is in a deal like this where that equity multiple is the key thing, it cannot be achieved unless that builder can sign on the debt. Right?
Repeat that.
You cannot achieve the required equity multiples in a vertical deal without a builder who has access to bank debt.
And
just
yeah, go for it.
Does that mean recourse or not necessarily?
There's only one caveat to that, is if that private builder is internally capitalized and will be providing all of the required equity out of their own pockets.
And then he can afford to get a higher loan. I mean, I think on general terms, if you have, to your point, Ian, a recourse loan, and that's why it's really important to understand that what's the financial capacity of a lot of the clients that are coming to buy these properties. A recourse loan from a bank is going to be priced probably in the 4s, maybe the 5s, where if you have, and maybe it could be even lower if it's a larger client with a larger project. If you have a non-recourse loan, it's going to be in the 9-10% double-digit range once you have all the points included. So to Steve's point, if you have a developer who's using all of his own internal money, then he could potentially pay for that higher loan. Although you think about it, it doesn't happen very often that the guy's got all the equity but can't get a bank loan. But I guess it could happen occasionally where you syndicate out the money and then you go get a high-priced loan and non-recourse, and the deal could potentially work. Yet, as Steve's saying, the debt needs to be in that, at least in today's environment, in that mid-single-digit range in order for a lot of these equity metrics that we're talking about to pass the hurdle that the third-party investors are typically looking for.
Right. I don't recall that we have ever been able to arrange equity for a project that was a smaller vertical construction deal that didn't have a sponsor that could sign on the debt. And you want to be real careful. If you're being told otherwise, the question is, are you being told that they're not likely to get the transaction closed?
Anyone out there in the audience have any questions? Now, I don't know if we're going to get into it on this session or the next one, but we're starting to touch on kind of the more complicated issues of then debt and understand what impacts the debt can have. Going back to the point earlier, we see a lot of packages where the guy assumes he's going to get 70% debt at a 4.5. When I say 70%, 70% of the capital stack at a 4.5% rate. And immediately we know I say that, I guess 70% in some situations could be achievable. But generally speaking, we understand that he's asking for too much and his leverage is too high. And we will demonstrate probably over future sessions what the impact has on debt when you move a 70% leverage down to 65% leverage and you move your 4.5 rate up to 5% rate. You can imagine what pulling those different levers has on the impacts of the return.
Why don't we do that right now?
Okay, let's do it.
Trev? Let's do it in the model we have here. So I think Dave brings up a really good point. It's a really pretty straightforward example to show here. On let's look at this deal right now. What we saw that worked was the sponsor being willing to sign on a bank loan at just under 75% of cost. If we change that to go to 50%.
Look at that.
Go to
60.
Go to 60. There we go. That's a good example. Say we just went to 60. Instead of a 174 multiple, we're now at a 151.
Show what the cursor where that is.
All of a sudden, that 151 is not enough to split up between the parties, which would imply that the only way to get there is by reduce the land value. Okay, Trev, go back over and go to 75% of cost.
You mentioned on eligible costs. What is not an eligible cost? Time of dollars, or what?
No, actually, pretty much there's very. I don't remember why I just said that for a long time and we've started to ignore it.
I'm sure there is a definition in the loan docs, but broad enough to probably cover almost everything.
Like sales and commissions, closing costs, stuff like that, it's not capitalized.
Yeah, there's certain costs that are not capitalized. There could be certain
LCU for sure.
There could be certain fees within partnerships that would not be eligible as well, but more or less everything we see in there would apply. The things that don't are what are your actual closing costs. Commissions, warranty, which is something that's taken out of the sales proceeds, things like that.
And can you guys opine on this? In our static history, we used to lump all that stuff down in the soft cost lines. And from working with your guys' cash flow, the way we think about cash flows in a deal, I think, should change or should be different. It should be revenues minus cost of goods sold. Those cost of goods sold are usually some of the same things that are considered SG&A by public builders. When you see those in their earnings reports, it's commissions, it's insurance, it's some of those costs that are deal specific related to the sale of that unit. And then you get into the project costs, the verticals, the horizontals, and that kind of the G&A, the G&A is in the SG&A. But from a financing perspective, the G&A is not going to, it's going to be an eligible cost.
It's going to be a capitalized cost.
Right. So So just understanding that there's some, I guess, fungibility in the way that these things are defined and the way the builders look at the flows into and out of a deal versus the way we historically have looked at them, I think is a little bit broader perspective. It's helped me understand what I'm hearing from builders when they're talking about these different things, G&A versus cost of goods sold versus some of these other things. There's a reason that they look at them the way they look at them. And that's, I guess, the comment.
By the way, thank you for opining on the fungibility.
You got it.
The infamous third bucket that, that you, Brian, were talking about, we're desperate to try and understand.
Is that the one you can pee on?
Could be. Everybody seems to have a little different idea.
Same guy.
I mean, is that coming into play as you do this analysis? Because I mean, the thing is a mystery to me, quite candidly. And is that being incorporated into your calculations? Because it can tend to swing rather wildly depending on which builder it is and what items they're throwing in there.
It's more of a land question than it's a finance question.
Well,
It's a buyer-seller more than it is.
But at the end of the day, if their cost to complete is, you were a finished lot value of $104,000, holy mackerel, that's what our cost to complete budgets are, if we're lucky these days.
Yeah, that tends to be, I've run into that with it's a land cost or a house cost thing.
Yeah.
And if it's not in one spot, you just have to make sure it's accounted for on the other side. And I think all those are probably eligible costs. But that's more like a finished lot definition thing that I've run into that I don't know that we still have a good or complete one. And I know there's definitely not one that everybody uses in the industry, so.
Yeah, as I think about your question, Doug, a big part of it to me is really assessing the quality of the diligence that your builder or developer is capable of doing. What we notice is, to take all the numbers aside, you can just tell real quickly the ones who have their shit together and the ones who don't.
By their budget?
By their budgets, by the way they present things, by the way they talk about things.
Yeah.
And certainly that, there are things that we can do from our side that make it easier to try and help out or mitigate those problems, like, talking about more and more always having cost to complete done up front, by the seller, because, whoever wants to start a negotiation by not setting the bar first, which is what that effectively does. So, these deals, when we do our analysis, we're typically we're taking what is given to us by our clients, but we're very closely scrutinizing what our experience tells us about those clients' ability to generate accurate numbers.
Conversely, as much as we need, those metrics that you're seeing in the market, we used to use the 100,000 for costs and fees. We better using 110, 115, 120 these days, or you have zero credibility. Conversely.
Absolutely. You guys, there's a lot of dynamic metrics going on in your world that we need to be sharing with one another so that we're using the right inputs as we underwrite these deals.
Steve, in this example, as your LTC goes up, the equity multiple goes up.
Mm-hmm.
Is that simplistically a function of the fact that debt is always cheaper than equity for your equity provider? Is that why the equity multiple keeps increasing? Or is it more complex than that?
Yes, you're correct, but it also goes one step beyond that, and that is with every extra dollar that you borrow, it's one less dollar of equity.
Right.
So as long as the debt is cheaper than the return you're getting what we'd call positive leverage or accretive leverage, which, especially in a situation where the bank is providing the loan, every dollar you get is always going to be accretive to one of these transactions because there's such a discrepancy in the return profiles between the debt and the equity. Right, and even like if you look at this, we went to 75, but say you're able to get to 80%, which is a real stretch. All of a sudden the equity multiple has gone up.
Yeah.
Now, if that was the case, it's probably 10% money. But even then, it doesn't knock you back down that much.
So outside of a deal like this in which, public wouldn't touch, although with that lot size, I guess it's debatable if they know where it's located. But assuming, I go to all my publics first, they go, no, I don't want this, it's 10 lots or whatever, there's some issue with it. Outside of those deals, from the finance perspective, how can a private try to compete or steal a deal from a public? Can they?
Not very well.
It's impossible.
No, not in today's world. It's really, really difficult. And what?
That's it, yeah, I mean.
I don't know, Trevor's shaking his head too.
Because the cost of capital is just so different, and I think that's one thing that is important to educate your sellers on, and we touched on this earlier, but hey, Mr. Seller, we're gonna try to get the publics, and here's how the public's gonna look at it, and this would result in this kind of land value. However, there are some risk A, risk B, risk C, as to why the publics may not want, ultimately buy this piece of property. In which case, we're then gonna have to shift to the private builders. And then let me show you how the metrics of the private builders are gonna look at this thing. And guess what? Your land residual has dropped tremendously. But I think we need to educate the seller up front to differentiate the ways in which the different parties look at it.
Well, it's driving the actions of the land speculator entitlement guys, because they don't have an exit strategy. If my price is gonna be so low with the private, and I can't attract the public, we don't have that land speculator type that wants to come in and buy a 30-lot deal. What are the options? He doesn't have anything right now.
No, those.
So it's terrible for that unentitled property owner.
Right.
It really limits his options.
And I do think, depending on what the deal profile is, like if the overall capitalization is really large, you can't even though the number of units might be attractive to a public, they now have other issues where it's like,
Mac has a new yacht with an eligible cost.
What other issues?
well, I mean, the other issues may be they have thresholds above a certain total capitalization, they have to get full board approval, or the way that they capitalize their costs, even though they haven't been expended. Once a deal gets booked and the peak capital's $80 million on the deal, they're clipping interest, their cost of funds at $80 million from day one. If there's a 12-month lead time to prep the site, they've got a shitload of interest that theoretically doesn't show up at first glance, right? Because the dollars aren't technically expended. So I'm just saying that the public builders capitalize their costs differently, public builder to public builder. And then, so you might have some of these deals that look like they'd be attractive to a public that really it's more a private type of deal. But it gets back to how we approach that seller, right? So we can't just go to the seller and say, publics have such a lower cost of capital, therefore publics are going to be your guy on this deal. There might be some nuances to the way the capital stack is, peak capital, the way the interest gets capitalized, that those guys may not touch it either, right? Because they only have, the other thing that I'm running into, we're closing a deal hopefully this week, knock on wood, that, yeah, you're telling me. That's what Amber tells me every day. That we're on our fourth escrow, fourth public builder, but we got tripped up on things like seller wanted to give a big seller carry component, and Pulte looked at it and said, it doesn't matter to us. You want to give us 50% seller financing? We don't want it. It doesn't move the needle for us because we capitalize everything as soon as the deal's booked. And ironically, we're doing it with a private builder who has come in now, and we don't have the full underwriting, so I'm going to do a forensic dive into this thing because it's friggin' fascinating. Lion's going to be closing this with Resmark as their third-party equity. A significantly lower number than we originally underwrote, that the seller originally underwrote to. But it's only through 3 friggin' hiccups. One was a total capitalization issue where now we need board approval. Board has a different risk profile. We want to totally re-entitle your shovel-ready deal. Seller says, screw you. All right, now we're to door number 2. Door number 2, we're going to give you this great financing package, seller carry. Doesn't work for us. We need the number to be X minus. Screw you. Door number 3. Well, Resmark and the seller's capital partner getting together up here and saying, enough's enough, jackasses, just do this deal at whatever the number is. So it's a pretty interesting case study on how the financing part of it ultimately drives getting the deal done, but not for reasons that we could have foresaw from the beginning. So the point is that whether they're public or private, the deal by deal situation and circumstances really need to be evaluated up front to the greatest extent possible, and that still doesn't prevent kind of the rules of the game from shifting midstream on you too. So this is more of a commentary about how dynamic the capital markets are right now on both sides of the ledger, public and private.
Yeah, well, and Tom, what you're talking about builds on another thing, which is, as you learn more about all these different metrics, and forget about if we're going to look at it on a private versus a public basis, but just take the whole discounted cash flow approach to things. What you also start to learn, which is really helpful, is the sensitivity to different inputs that all these deals have. Right? And it may just sound like nothing. Somebody says, well, we're not going to do 4 units a month, we're going to do 3. Depending upon the deal, that can be enough to completely turn the entire return profile upside down. Doesn't matter if it's a public or a private.
Or somebody wants you to underwrite it at 4 and the market's 1.5. Run into that quite a bit here in Orange County. And I'll talk to the product type's a big issue too. So we're underwriting a bunch of podium and type 1 stuff right now.
Mm-hmm.
There are dynamics related with building and closing that. There's consumer financing thresholds that you have to reach in order for the buyers to get their financing. There's construction thresholds you need to meet with pre-sales in order to get your construction financing. So there's some of those things too that impact the timing on this stuff quite a bit. So that's something I want to talk to you guys about, what you're seeing.
Yeah, well, but also with things like that, and that's why it's good to understand this. Something like that, for instance, you'd look at it, you'd say, well, somebody might look at it and say, oh, podium deal, I just need, it's infill Orange County, I just need to get a 12% margin. Well, it's actually, no, it's like a 20.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Because of, and that's the beauty of discounted cash flow and looking at these things as you break it down. It's about that total amount of money that has to go out the door. And the fact that you, instead of delivering 6 units in a phase, you just delivered all 60 units in the whole project, right, the same day.
So your money is
out longer, and that's where you can tie it back to those 4 items that we talked about earlier today. By definition, a project like that's going to be longer term in nature, which means IRR is going to be weighted a little bit more heavily as a metric. You're going to have, if you look at your net margin on that deal, which, in the way we're talking about is probably right, because you're not going to likely have a public that's going to build that product type. That's going to have to blow out. Your equity multiple is going to have to be a little bit higher because it's a longer duration deal. And you start to see all these different things, and you can use them to back into whether or not a deal makes sense.
Yeah.
Right, and what we're trying to do, and we're working with Dave a lot on, is, and what Doug's talking about is helping to get that information to you guys to understand what people are looking for, so that information is available. And as this kind of analysis is done, it's there, it's quickly able to be utilized. We're able to gather data points from across the company to find it, to get smarter about public, private, you name it, how people are backing into some of these things, with the end goal always being, does this deal have a chance to get done? Can I make a more honest assessment of it with data?
Hey, I think that's a great way to close, because that's really the objective here, is to have a little bit cleaner sense going into these deals, what the expectations of the seller are, advising them on the way that different buyers are going to be looking at this, and is there a deal? And I think through this process, not only will we be more efficient with our time, but we will also come across much more sophisticated to our clients in earning their trust and long-term relationships. So, hey, with that, I think it's a good time to wrap up. We'll get to these other questions about yacht eligibility and private plane eligibility next time, I guess. But, I want to thank Steve and Trevor for coming in, and hopefully that was helpful for everyone. And again, step one of several phases that we'll keep introducing you guys.
Thanks, great, thanks.
What happens when
it gets to class? You can
have some notes, like a clip notes or something?
Not for you.